Saint-Domingue was not just the richest colony on Earth, it was the most racially complex society the Atlantic world had ever seen. Before revolution, before Haiti, there was a caste system designed to control difference, and it didn't work. This video is for educational and historical analysis. It does not endorse racial hierarchy, caste systems, or discrimination. These structures are examined critically to understand how power operated in colonial Saint-Domingue. Before Saint-Domingue became the richest colony in the Caribbean, it was a devastated frontier. In the early 1600s, Spain carried out what historians called the destruction of Osorio, a scorched earth campaign that burned settlements and forcibly depopulated Western Hispaniola. As documented by Caribbean historians such as Frank Moya Ponce and Carlos Esteban Dave, entire regions were left empty to stop smuggling and piracy. This deliberate abandonment created a massive power vacuum. Into that vacuum came French pirates, buccaneers, and smugglers. As Laurent Dubois and David Gegus explain, these groups did not conquer the land overnight. They occupied it slowly, informally, settling abandoned coastlines and building the foundations of what would become French Saint-Domingue. Not everyone left. As documented by Richard Price and Carolyn Fick, maroon communities formed deep in forests and mountains, composed of Africans who escaped enslavement and built autonomous settlements beyond colonial control. Along the coasts, some Blancos de Orilla, poor Spaniards, remained, surviving through fishing and frontier trade. Indigenous descendants and mixed frontier families also persisted in the north and south, though their numbers were small. These early populations formed the first non-European social roots encountered by the French in Western Hispaniola, shaping the frontier society that followed. In 1697, France formally secured the western third of Hispaniola through the Treaty of Ryswick. As Laurent Dubois, John Garrigus, and David Gegus document, Saint-Domingue was rapidly transformed into a plantation empire. Millions of Africans were forcibly imported from West Africa, Central Africa, and the Bight of Benin to sustain sugar, coffee, and indigo production. But the colony was never only African and French. Archival records cited by Moreau de Saint-Méry reveal a highly mixed colonial society, including Spanish settlers, British traders, Irish soldiers, Sephardic Jews, Levantine merchants, indigenous survivors, and Creole populations. Over time, these groups interacted, mixed, and produced new identities within a fluid but unequal colonial order. To manage this diversity, France constructed a racial caste system, rigid in law but fluid in practice. Grands Blancs, plantation elites. As described by John Garrigus in Before Haiti, the Grands Blancs lived as if France itself had been reconstructed around them. They wore muted silks and fine linens, ivory, gray, deep blue, powdered wigs, and restrained gold embroidery. Bright colors were avoided. Refinement itself became a language of power. Their estates featured marble floors, imported furniture, formal gardens, and commanding views over the land they controlled. Daily life followed strict ritual, managing plantations through intermediaries, hosting salons, dining formally, and maintaining rigid social distance from petits blancs, free people of color, and the enslaved. Educated in France, they embraced classical music, opera, French literature, and Enlightenment philosophy. Ideals often admired in theory, rarely applied in practice. As historians note, Grands Blancs ruled not only by violence, but by performance. Petits Blancs. Poor Europeans below them stood the Petits Blancs, whites whose social position rested more on law than power. As documented by Garrigus and Gegus, Petit blancs were often economically and socially below the mulatto elite and other free people of color, many of whom owned property, businesses, workshops, and even plantations. Their daily lives were harsh. They worked as dock laborers, overseers, soldiers, clerks, and craftsmen. Clothing reflected this reality: coarse fabrics, patched coats, worn shoes, often stained brown from sun, dust, and labor. What sustained their sense of superiority was not wealth or refinement, but the colonial caste system itself. Legal whiteness placed them above all people of color, regardless of reality. When mulattoes surpassed them in education, wealth, and social grace, resentment intensified, often expressed through aggressive and violent racism, a pattern widely noted in colonial records. Gens de couleur libres, free people of color. Between whites and the enslaved stood the gens de couleur libres, free people of color. As described in detail by Moreau de Saint-Méry and later analyzed by Garrigus, they were not a single group, but a ranked class shaped by ancestry, appearance, wealth, recognition, and different new races. The first race and most represented race were the mulattoes. People of mixed African and European ancestry formed the largest group. Many were born free to mulatto or Affranchi mothers and wealthy white fathers. Because status followed the mother, they inherited freedom, and sometimes education, property, or patronage. Many studied in France and returned fluent in European law and culture. Others were born to poor petit blancs and lacked economic advantage, yet still belonged to the free colored class. Another racial category were the white mulattoes, or quadroons, often three-quarters European, occupied a privileged position. As Garrigus documents, appearance frequently mattered more than genealogy. Through wealth, marriage, and recognition, some quadroons were legally reclassified as white. The marabouts reflected even more complex ancestry: African, European, indigenous, and sometimes Middle Eastern. As recorded in colonial descriptions, some marabouts originated as mulattoes, who fled birth slavery and frontier conditions, escaping into mountainous regions where they mixed with indigenous survivors and African maroons. Over time, some reintegrated into mulatto society as free people of color, seeking stability and protection. Métis, or Creoles, often one-quarter Native American indigenous and three-quarters European, they were the first free people of color. They occupied a unique and uneasy position. Free by birth and often educated, they stood outside the black-white mixed-race hierarchy. As colonial records note, they were sometimes distinguishable from whites only by a slight tan, yet still denied full whiteness. Together, these divisions show that freedom did not mean equality. Race determined how free one was allowed to be. Another group in the caste system of Saint-Domingue were the Affranchi, free black people. Separate from the free colored elite were the Affranchis, formerly enslaved people who obtained freedom. As Dubois and Gegus explain, when it was mixed-race mulatto baby, they were freed at birth. But others, mostly from the black African racial category, purchased freedom later in life. While a small minority accumulated wealth, most lived as artisans, farmers, soldiers, or laborers. This group was predominantly black. They remained socially constrained and distinct from the mulatto elite. At the bottom stood the enslaved African majority. As documented across plantation records and shipping data, mortality was extreme. Disease, punishment, famine, and overwork forced France to constantly import new captives. Slavery was not limited to whites. As Garrigus and Dubois confirm, mulattoes, marabout, and other free people of color also owned enslaved labor, particularly on coffee plantations. This demographic reality helps explain why many modern Haitians with darker skin and strong sub-Saharan features descend from later African arrivals, while mixed Creole families formed older, long-established lineages. From the caste system emerged a powerful mulatto elite. As Garrigues demonstrates, this elite formed consciously, not merely through wealth, but through racial solidarity. Networks of surnames, godparenthood, legal advocacy, and pooled capital allowed poorer mulattoes to rise within the free-colored class. Marabouts and white mulattoes sought access to these networks. Boundaries remained strict, inclusive by race, exclusive by loyalty and recognition. Alexandre Pétion illustrates this complexity. Though a dark-skinned quadroon whose father reportedly doubted his paternity, Pétion was socially and politically absorbed into the mulatto elite. As historians note, appearance and lived identity mattered more than genealogy. Though he was never fully embraced by the whitest quadroons, he was considered a mulatto quadroon, a half-breed by distinction. Mulatto elites dominated urban centers: Port-au-Prince, Jérémie, Léogane, Jacmel, Les Cayes, and Cap Français suburbs, controlling commerce, militias, and property. Organized, armed, and politically conscious, they became increasingly independent from white authority. The racial category of quadroons, often called white mulattoes, occupied the highest tier of free-colored society. Through marriage, wealth, and recognition, families could produce children legally classified as white. In Saint-Domingue, race was not fixed by blood alone. It was negotiated through phenotype, status, and colonial acceptance, as documented in countless legal petitions. The caste system did not dissolve peacefully. It fractured through conflict. As Dubois and James document, the most dangerous rivalry was between the mulatto elite and the Grands Blancs. Organized, wealthy, and politically aware, mulatto leaders such as Rigaud and Pétion challenged white supremacy, commanded militias, and promoted institutional governance. From exclusion to leadership, the mulatto elite transformed Saint-Domingue's social and political order, helping dismantle the caste system and permanently reshaping Haiti's historical trajectory. This video synthesizes multiple scholarly perspectives. Historical categories were fluid, contested, and shaped by colonial power.